Number 1. Christian Bahena Rivera. It was shortly after 7:30 on a warm July evening in 2018 when 20-year-old University of Iowa student Molly Tibbetts set out for her usual run through the streets of Brooklyn, a small town surrounded by cornfields in Poweshiek County. She had been staying at her boyfriend's home while he was out of town for work, caring for his dogs and keeping her routine. Neighbors later reported seeing her jogging along familiar roads, wearing running clothes and earbuds, passing houses she had passed countless times before. Nothing that evening suggested danger. She exchanged messages with her boyfriend, finished tasks for work, and stepped out into the fading daylight for a run she had done many times. By the next morning, she would not show up for her job at a children's day camp, and her disappearance would launch one of the largest searches in Iowa history. Just a few miles away, 24-year-old Christian Bahena Rivera was finishing another day at Yarrabee Farms, a dairy operation outside Brooklyn where he milked cows, cleaned barns, and handled routine chores. He had been in the United States since he was a teenager, having crossed the border illegally and later obtaining work under the alias John Budd. Investigators would eventually learn that he lived alone, kept a low profile, and drove a black Chevy Malibu that blended in easily with other rural vehicles. But on the evening of July 18th, surveillance cameras along Molly's running route captured that Malibu, circling the area, passing her multiple times, and eventually slowing near where she ran. Those images would become the first major breakthrough in a case that began as a missing person search and quickly turned into a homicide investigation. When Molly failed to report to work the next day, her family immediately knew something was wrong. She was reliable, responsible, and connected to her loved ones. Her absence was out of character. Within hours, law enforcement from the Poweshiek County Sheriff's Office, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, and federal agencies joined the search. They reviewed her Fitbit data, traced her phone activity, canvassed neighborhoods, questioned witnesses, and sorted through hundreds of tips. Yet for nearly 5 weeks, no one knew where she was, and no physical evidence pointed to her location. The only concrete lead that survived early scrutiny was the surveillance footage of the dark Malibu repeatedly moving near her jogging route. On August 21st, investigators tracked the Malibu to Bahena Rivera at Yarrabee Farms. He agreed to speak with them, and over the course of an extended interview, they showed him the surveillance clips. The images were clear enough that he eventually admitted the car was his. As the interview continued, Rivera described seeing Molly jog, finding her attractive, and following her in his car. He told detectives he parked, got out, and ran alongside her. When she told him to leave her alone and threatened to call the police, he said he became angry. He claimed that he then blacked out, a phrase he repeated several times. According to investigators, he later said that when he regained awareness, she was in the trunk of his car. That same night, Rivera led detectives deep into a rural cornfield about 12 miles southeast of Brooklyn. He walked them to a specific spot, pointing through rows of tall stalks to where he had left her weeks earlier. Molly's body was found under corn leaves deliberately placed over her. The Iowa State Medical Examiner's Office identified her the next day and concluded that she died from multiple sharp force injuries. The exact number of wounds was not made public, but the cause and manner of death, homicide, were clear. Rivera was charged almost immediately with first-degree murder and held on a $5 million cash-only bond. Over the next 3 years, the case moved through the Iowa courts with significant public attention. Defense attorneys challenged Rivera's statements to police, arguing that he was effectively in custody during the early hours of interrogation and that his rights had been violated. Prosecutors countered that he spoke voluntarily, was repeatedly advised of his rights, and ultimately provided information only the killer could have known, including the precise location of the body. The trial began in May of 2021, moved to Scott County due to extensive pretrial publicity. Jurors heard from investigators, forensic experts, and analysts who reconstructed Molly's last run using digital data, video footage, and Rivera's own words. They viewed the surveillance recordings that showed the Malibu circling her route. They learned that Tibbetts' blood was found in the trunk of Rivera's car. They heard how he led police to her remains in the middle of a dark, expansive field where someone unfamiliar with the area could not reasonably navigate. When Rivera took the stand, he abandoned the account he had given investigators. Instead of admitting to following her, becoming angry, blacking out, and later discovering her in his trunk, He introduced an entirely new version. He claimed that two masked men kidnapped him at gunpoint, forced him to drive, and ordered him to follow Tibbets. He testified that one of the masked men killed her and told him to hide the body. No physical evidence, witness testimony, or forensic data supported the existence of these supposed men. Prosecutors argued that the story was fabricated to deflect responsibility and conflicted with almost every verifiable point in the investigation. On May 28, 2021, after deliberating for several hours, the jury found Rivera guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was announced in a packed courtroom in Davenport, bringing an end to nearly 3 years of uncertainty for the Tibbets family. Under Iowa law, a first-degree murder conviction carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On August 30th, Judge Joel Yates imposed that sentence, noting that Rivera offered no credible explanation for why he stalked, confronted, and ultimately killed a young woman who was simply out for an evening run. In the years since, Rivera has pursued appeals and motions, claiming newly discovered evidence and challenging aspects of his interrogation. In 2023, the Iowa Court of Appeals upheld the conviction, rejecting arguments about Miranda violations and finding no basis to believe the trial outcome would have changed. Rivera remains incarcerated at Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison, serving life without parole. The details of the case, from the surveillance footage to Rivera's shifting explanations, shaped it into one of the most widely discussed crimes in the country. The fact that he was an undocumented farm worker using an alias, that he had lived in Iowa for years with little public visibility, and that he targeted a stranger during a routine jog contributed to national debates over immigration enforcement and employment verification. The sentence imposed, life without the possibility of parole, means he will spend the rest of his life in an Iowa prison, with no legal path to release, apart from extraordinary judicial intervention. Number 2. Jose Antonio Ibarra. It was just after 9 in the morning on February 22, 2024, when 22-year-old nursing student Laken Hope Riley entered the wooded trail near Lake Herrick on the University of Georgia campus in Athens. She had taken that route many times before. Her smartwatch recorded her pace, and her phone remained in her hand as she ran along the narrow path that cut between the lake and the tree line. Other students were moving across campus at the same time, heading to mid-morning classes. Nothing in the area suggested immediate danger. Riley was last seen on a campus security camera at 9:06, jogging steadily toward the Oconee Forest Park entrance. Within minutes, she was off camera and out of sight. Less than 1 mile from the trail, 26-year-old Jose Antonio Ibarra had already been moving through the area. He lived in an apartment complex nearby and had walked along the campus perimeter repeatedly that week. Ibarra entered the United States illegally in September 2022 near El Paso, Texas, where he was detained briefly and released into the country pending immigration processing. Afterward, he lived in New York City, where he was arrested for a child endangerment-related scooter incident and later traveled to Georgia. In October 2023, he and his brother were arrested for shoplifting in Athens. When he failed to appear in court on that charge, a warrant was issued. On the morning of Riley's death, a UGA student had already reported a man peering into her apartment window, an incident later tied to Ibarra and included as a peeping Tom charge in the indictment. Investigators would later reconstruct Riley's final movements with precise time markers. At 9:11, her phone placed an incomplete call to emergency services. Forensic examiners determined the call was made during a struggle. Her smartwatch recorded a sharp rise in heart rate and then an abrupt cessation of activity at approximately 9:28. When Riley did not return, her roommate contacted campus police at 12:07. Officers located Riley's body at 12:38 in a wooded area behind Lake Herrick. She had suffered multiple head wounds and showed signs of attempted assault. First responders attempted CPR, but she was already deceased. The investigation moved quickly. Surveillance footage captured a man resembling Ibarra walking near the crime scene around the relevant time frame. A jacket found in a dumpster near his apartment contained Riley's hair. His roommates identified him as the person who disposed of the clothing. Officers who spoke with Ibarra noticed fresh injuries on his hands and arms, including abrasions consistent with a physical struggle. Forensic testing later recovered Ibarra's fingerprint on Riley's phone and Riley's DNA under his fingernails. Detectives concluded that Riley was attacked, forcibly restrained, and beaten with a rock, which caused complex skull fractures and asphyxiation. A Clark County grand jury indicted Ibarra on 10 counts: malice murder, 3 counts of felony murder, kidnapping with bodily injury, aggravated assault with intent to grape, aggravated battery, false imprisonment, hindering an emergency telephone call, concealing the death of another, and peeping Tom. Ibarra pleaded not guilty. His attorneys sought a change of venue, citing extensive media coverage, but the court denied the motion. Ibarra later waived his right to a jury trial and elected a bench trial before Judge H. Patrick Haggard. The trial began on November 15, 2024, in Athens' Clark County Superior Court. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence showing the sequence of events from the moment Riley entered the wooded path to the final moments recorded by her smartwatch. A medical examiner testified that the fatal injuries were caused by blunt force trauma from a single object, consistent with a rock recovered near the scene. The partial disrobing and bruising indicated an attempted assault. Analysts described how Riley's phone dialed 911 during the attack and how the call ended abruptly. Surveillance footage, the discarded jacket, and witness statements further placed Ibarra near the scene. On November 20th, Judge Haggard found Ibarra guilty on all 10 counts. He sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty available without a jury-imposed death sentence in Georgia. Additional sentences on the non-murder counts were ordered to run concurrently or consecutively, but had no practical effect on the life without parole term. Ibarra was transferred to the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison, where the state houses inmates serving its longest sentences. The case drew national attention because of Ibarra's immigration history. Federal officials confirmed he had entered the country illegally in 2022 and was later released pending further immigration action. His prior arrests in New York and Georgia, including the outstanding warrant for the shoplifting case, became central in political discussions about enforcement gaps. In the months following Riley's death, lawmakers introduced the Laken-Riley Act, requiring federal detention of certain undocumented individuals arrested for theft or burglary. The bill passed both chambers and was signed into law in early 2025. After sentencing, Ibarra's post-conviction attorneys filed motions seeking a new trial. They argued that his waiver of a jury trial may not have been made with full understanding, citing a possible congenital cognitive deficiency. Judge Haggard ordered a mental evaluation, noting there had been no earlier findings of incompetence, but allowing assessment for the sake of the record. As of the latest court updates, the evaluation process is ongoing. The verdict, however, remains intact, and Ibarra continues serving life without parole. Jose Antonio Ibarra will remain in state custody for the rest of his life. Under Georgia law, a life without parole sentence allows no petition for release based on time served. Only a successful appeal or extraordinary executive intervention could alter the sentence, and neither is currently in motion. Number 3. Luis Bracamontes. It was just after 8:30 in the morning on October 24th, 2014, when Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies Danny Oliver and his partner rolled into the parking lot of a Motel 6 in the Arden Arcade district. The sun was already up, commuters were filling the streets, and nothing about the quiet motel hinted that one of the most violent attacks on law enforcement in California history was minutes away. The deputies were doing a routine check of a suspicious vehicle, a silver Toyota Corolla with Utah plates, parked crookedly and idling. Oliver approached on the driver's side, leaning slightly to look inside. He barely had time to speak. The driver, Luis Enrique Monroy Bracamontes, a man who had already been deported twice and illegally re-entered the United States, raised a 9mm handgun and fired a single round through the window. Deputy Oliver fell instantly, shot in the forehead at point-blank range. His partner scrambled back, returning fire as the suspect accelerated out of the parking lot, tires screeching as he fled into the morning traffic. For Bracamontes, this was only the beginning. Minutes later, he tried to carjack a passing motorist, Anthony Davis, shooting him multiple times and leaving him bleeding in the street. Davis survived. Bracamontes and his wife, Janelle Monroy, who had been riding with him, then abandoned their car, commandeered another, and sped toward Placer County, leaving behind a trail of spent casings, frantic 911 calls, and a deputy dead in a motel parking lot. By late morning, the manhunt stretched across 2 counties. Officers from multiple agencies fanned out across Auburn, where reports came in of a suspicious man armed with a rifle moving through residential streets. Deputies Michael David Davis Jr. and Jeff Davis responded, unaware that Bracamontes had switched weapons, now carrying an AR-15 style rifle he retrieved from his stolen vehicle. The deputies arrived at a bend in a quiet Auburn neighborhood. As they stepped out of their patrol car, Bracamontes opened fire from behind cover. The first round struck Detective Michael Davis Jr., fatally wounding him. His partner, Deputy Jeff Davis, was hit and thrown backward, injured but alive. In seconds, the hillside erupted into gunfire as officers returned fire, calling for backup as Bracamontes fled again, sprinting between homes and over fences with his rifle slung across his chest. During trial, prosecutors would later say that every movement he made that day showed intent, ambushing officers, running toward confrontation rather than away, and firing until his magazines ran dry. The spree pushed the region into lockdown. Schools closed, streets were barricaded, helicopters circled overhead as officers searched yards, sheds, drainage ditches, anywhere a cornered gunman could hide. It took nearly 6 hours before officers found him, crouched inside the fenced courtyard of a nearby home, exhausted, out of ammunition, and no longer able to run. He surrendered without a word. But once inside the courtroom, the silence ended. Bracamontes confessed repeatedly, loudly, proudly, and with no remorse. During one hearing, he shouted at deputies' families, "I killed your fucking cops." At another, he said he wished he had killed more. During jury selection, he blurted out, "I am guilty. I shot them. I don't regret anything." His outburst became so disruptive, prosecutors considered requesting chemical restraints. The judge ultimately allowed the trial to continue with heavy security and frequent removals of the defendant from the courtroom. Investigators built the timeline piece by piece. Bracamontes had been deported twice, in 1997 and 2001. He re-entered illegally and lived in Utah under the name Marcelo Marquez. His wife helped him carry ammunition and move rifles between vehicles during the spree. Ballistics linked his 9mm handgun to Deputy Oliver's murder. The AR-15 style rifle matched the rounds that killed Michael Davis Jr. and wounded others. Civilian witnesses identified him from carjackings and shootings throughout the day. The evidence overwhelming, the motive chillingly simple: hatred of law enforcement, fueled by methamphetamine, criminal history, and a willingness to shoot first at anyone wearing a badge. On February 9, 2018, after weeks of testimony from wounded deputies, frantic motorists, forensic experts, and Bracamontes himself, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, killing peace officers, multiple murders, attempted murders, carjackings, and weapons charges. In the penalty phase, prosecutors presented additional evidence of his violent past. The jury took little time. They recommended the death penalty. On April 26th, Judge Steve White formally sentenced Luis Enrique Monroy Bracamontes to death, plus additional decades for the non-capital charges. His wife, Janelle Monroy, was convicted separately and sentenced to nearly 50 years to life, ensuring she will also never walk free again. Bracamontes now sits on California's death row, defiant, unrepentant, and still denying nothing. When asked during sentencing if he understood the consequences, he smiled and said he wished he had killed more. For the families of deputies Danny Oliver and Michael Davis Jr., the sentence closed one chapter, but never fully healed what was taken that morning. 2 law enforcement officers, fathers, husbands, sons, were killed in ambush attacks while doing routine community work. A civilian nearly died during a carjacking. Another deputy still suffers from the injuries of that day. And at the center of it all, a man who crossed the border illegally, ignored deportations, armed himself, and carried out one of the most calculated killing sprees against law enforcement in California's history. There is no ambiguity, no appeals that can change the evidence, no possibility of release. Luis Bracamontes will die behind bars, the only ending possible after a day defined by rage, gunfire, and the deliberate targeting of those sworn to protect others. Number 4. Luis Rodrigo Perez. It was just after midnight on November 1st, 2018, when neighbors on the 900 block of East Locust Street in Springfield, Missouri, began calling 911. Multiple shots had been fired inside a small rental house where several young adults were staying. The first officers who stepped through the doorway found 2 men on the floor, both fatally wounded, and 2 others injured and bleeding. The interior showed signs of a close-range attack: spent casings on the ground, blood pooling beneath overturned furniture, and no indication that anyone had been able to defend themselves. The victims were later identified as 28-year-old Stephen Marler and 26-year-old Aaron Josh Hampton, roommates who had shared that home only days earlier with a man police would soon identify as the likely shooter, 23-year-old Luis Rodrigo Perez. Before the killings, Perez had been living in Springfield for only a short time. Months earlier, he had been held at the Middlesex County Jail in New Jersey on domestic violence-related charges. Immigration and Customs Enforcement had filed a detainer requesting notification before his release, but the jail, following county policy, declined to honor it. He walked out in February 2018 and eventually made his way to Southwest Missouri, where he rented a room with Marler and Hampton. The arrangement did not last. Witnesses later told detectives there had been tension in the house, arguments, and ultimately an eviction. Perez left angry. According to statements gathered in the investigation, he blamed his roommates for throwing him out and believed they had disrespected him. That anger, prosecutors argued, became the motive for what happened next. In the days leading up to the shootings, Perez acquired a handgun that had been stolen from an unlocked vehicle. The person who stole it was 21-year-old Sabrina Starr, a woman he knew socially. She had given him the gun days before the murders, posting photos of a fresh tattoo he had inked on her neck: "Kill or be killed." Those images appeared on her Facebook page on October 28th, just 4 days before she would be found dead herself. Around the same period, co-defendant Aaron Anderson told police that Perez talked openly about needing a weapon. Text messages recovered later showed him calling the firearm dirty and saying it got bodies, language prosecutors described as a sign of his mindset leading up to the attacks. Shortly after midnight on November 1st, Perez returned to the house on East Locust. According to witness statements, he arrived with Anderson and Starr waiting outside in a vehicle. Anderson later told detectives that Perez placed him on speakerphone as he walked toward the house. Over that call, he said he could hear voices inside, pleading, struggling, begging for their lives. Inside, Marler and Hampton were shot multiple times. 2 other occupants survived with serious injuries. When officers arrived, there was no sign of Perez. Witness interviews pointed detectives toward him almost immediately. But before police could locate him, another crime scene would emerge. On November 2nd, less than 24 hours after the double homicide, Sabrina Starr's stepfather found her dead inside her home on North Oakland Avenue. She had been shot at close range. The home showed no signs of forced entry, and investigators quickly connected her killing to the events on East Locust. Prosecutors later argued that Starr had become a liability to Perez. She had provided the weapon, she knew details of the shootings, and she had been present when he left for the first attack. Eliminating her, they argued, removed a direct witness who could tie him to the murders. A regional manhunt ended on November 5th when an off-duty Springfield police officer spotted Perez entering a Walmart with Anderson and others. Officers moved in quickly. Perez was arrested without incident and taken to the Greene County Jail. Booking records listed 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree assault, multiple counts of armed criminal action, and an ICE hold confirming federal interest in his immigration status. As the investigation unfolded, the backstory drew national attention. ICE issued a public statement calling the murders preventable, arguing that Perez would have been deported months earlier had Middlesex County honored their detainer. County officials countered that ICE had 51 days to secure a judicial warrant and failed to do so. The dispute did nothing to change the facts in Missouri. 5 people had been shot, 3 were dead, and the man accused of killing them was already in custody. In 2019, Greene County prosecutors announced they were initially pursuing the death penalty. Court filings and local reporting described a methodical preparation for trial, including witness interviews, digital forensics, and statements from co-defendants. By the time the case reached court in 2022, prosecutors had withdrawn the death penalty, but Perez still faced the possibility of multiple life sentences. His trial was held without a jury, a bench trial presided over by Judge Tom Mountjoy. During the proceedings, the state presented witness accounts, ballistic evidence, phone records, and testimony connecting Perez to the stolen handgun used in all 3 killings. The narrative prosecutors outlined was blunt: a retaliatory attack on former roommates, followed by the elimination of a witness. Anderson's statement about hearing victims beg for their lives became one of the most powerful pieces of testimony. Digital evidence showed Perez attempting to get rid of the gun afterward, describing it as dirty and discussing the need for another heater. Starr's tattoo, applied days before the killings, was introduced as evidence of the attitudes circulating within the group. In October 2022, Judge Mountjoy found Perez guilty on all major counts: 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree assault, and multiple counts of armed criminal action. On January 6, 2023, he imposed 5 consecutive life sentences, 3 without the possibility of parole, and 2 with the possibility of parole. The structure of the sentencing meant that even if Perez were someday eligible for parole on the assault convictions, he would still be required to serve 3 full life sentences without any chance of release. The final court record leaves no ambiguity. The killings began as retaliation against former roommates, widened into the murder of a woman tied to the weapon he used, and ended with a man in custody who had crossed multiple state lines after being released from jail despite an ICE detainer. The sentences imposed ensure that Luis Rodrigo Perez will remain in the custody of the Missouri Department of Corrections for the rest of his life. There is no mechanism for release, and no realistic legal path that would allow him to walk free again. Number 5. Edwin Ramos. It was late afternoon on June 22, 2008, when 48-year-old Anthony Tony Bologna turned onto a narrow street in San Francisco's Excelsior district with 3 of his sons in the car. They had just driven back from a family gathering in Fairfield. The windows were down, the weather was warm, and they were only blocks from home. In the front passenger seat sat 20-year-old Michael. 16-year-old Matthew was in the back. His brother Andrew sat beside him. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where families had lived for generations. As Tony slowed near a stop sign at Maynard and Congdon, another vehicle pulled up alongside, a dark Chrysler with 3 men inside. Within seconds, the quiet street would be replaced by the sound of gunfire. 21-year-old Edwin Ramos was behind the wheel of that Chrysler. He had spent most of his teens and early adulthood in the Bay Area, drifting in and out of gang circles linked to the 20th Street clique of MS-13. Ramos had entered the United States as a teenager on a temporary visa from El Salvador. He overstayed it, building a life in San Francisco's Mission District and later in the East Bay. By the time the summer of 2008 arrived, he had a juvenile record that included assaults, attempted robbery, and repeated contact with police in gang-related investigations. Under San Francisco's juvenile sanctuary rules at the time, none of his prior juvenile offenses resulted in an immigration referral, and he remained in the city despite his unlawful status. On the afternoon of the Bologna murders, prosecutors would later argue Ramos was looking for retaliation. Hours earlier, another shooting involving Norteño gang members had taken place. Gang investigators testified that Ramos and others believed they had been targeted and were searching for what they thought were rival members. When the Chrysler pulled up beside the Bologna family car, Ramos and the others inside misidentified the occupants, 3 generations of the same family, as rival gang members. At that moment, the mistaken identification would prove fatal. The shots came through the driver's side window of the Chrysler, tearing into the Bologna family's Honda. Tony was struck first. Michael was hit next. Matthew, sitting behind his father, was shot and gravely wounded. Andrew, beside him, was uninjured physically, but watched the scene unfold in a few terrifying seconds. When the gunfire stopped, the Chrysler sped away. Tony and Michael died instantly. Matthew, 16, died later at San Francisco General Hospital. Andrew survived and would become the key eyewitness in the case. In the immediate hours after the shooting, police treated the incident as a possible road rage attack. But as witness statements came in and Andrew described the shooter's vehicle and appearance, the homicide detail began connecting it to gang intelligence files. 3 days later, investigators arrested Ramos at his home in El Sobrante. He denied being the shooter. At various points, he claimed an acquaintance, Wilfredo Flaco Reyes, also linked to MS-13, was responsible. But the evidence placing Ramos at the scene, combined with Andrew's identification, gang testimony, and ballistic analysis from prior stops involving Ramos's associates, moved the case toward trial. The prosecution's narrative, developed over 4 years of pre-trial hearings, was that this was a deliberate, premeditated gang retaliation carried out in broad daylight against a misidentified family. Witnesses described Ramos's gang ties dating back to his adolescence. Prosecutors introduced evidence about a March 2008 traffic stop where police had discovered a gun in a car Ramos was driving, a gun later tied to a double homicide. Those charges were never filed against him, but they reinforced the gang involvement narrative the state would use in court. Andrew Bologna testified during the proceedings. He told jurors about sitting in the back seat, seeing the Chrysler pull up, watching a man lean toward the window, and hearing the shots that killed his father and brothers. He identified Ramos as the man he had seen behind the wheel. The trial lasted months. Defense attorneys argued that Ramos was not the shooter and that the real gunman was Reyes. They challenged witness credibility and attempted to cast doubt on gang expert testimony. But the prosecution emphasized California's murder statutes. Even if Ramos had not fired the weapon, acting in concert with gunmen in a coordinated retaliatory attack constituted first-degree murder under special circumstance law. On May 9, 2012, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder, plus attempted murder for Andrew. Jurors also found true the special circumstances of multiple murders and gang enhancements, establishing that the killings were willful, deliberate, and tied to organized gang activity. Although the jury deadlocked on the narrow question of whether Ramos personally fired the gun, California law did not require unanimous agreement on that detail to convict under the theories presented. Sentencing took place in June. Tony's widow, Danielle Bologna, addressed the court, describing the loss of her husband and 2 of her sons. The prosecution asked for the maximum penalty allowed. Judge Charles Haynes imposed 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive terms for the attempted murder and firearm enhancements, more than 180 years to life in total. The sentence ensured that Ramos would never be released. He was transferred to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, where he remains today, serving a term that has no parole eligibility. His appeals have failed. In 2014, the California Court of Appeal upheld his convictions and denied claims that the trial was tainted by improper gang evidence or involuntary statements. Only a minor correction to the abstract of judgment was ordered. The life without parole terms stand as imposed. Edwin Ramos will spend the rest of his life in prison. Number 6. Carlos Arevalo Carranza. It was just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon on February 28, 2019, when a worried son unlocked the front door of his mother's home on Knollfield Way in South San Jose. 59-year-old Bambi Larson hadn't shown up for work at the medical diagnostics company where she managed laboratory operations, something she never failed to do. Lights were still off, her car was still in the driveway, and there were no signs of forced entry, but the silence inside the home was heavy enough to raise immediate alarm. He stepped cautiously down the hallway toward her bedroom. What he found ended any remaining hope. Larson was lying on the floor beside her bed, motionless. Blood stained the sheets, the carpet, and her clothing. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but she had been gone for hours. The autopsy would later show sharp force injuries to her neck and torso, multiple stab wounds delivered in the early morning hours while the neighborhood slept. As detectives began documenting the scene, nothing about the attack appeared random. There were footprints on the floor, traces of blood that did not belong to her, and signs that someone had quickly moved through the house. But who would target a woman with no known enemies, no criminal ties, and no history suggesting danger? On the other side of the city, 24-year-old Carlos Eduardo Arevalo Carranza was drifting between homeless encampments and temporary apartments, staying in a pattern law enforcement already knew well. Born in El Salvador, he had entered the United States illegally years earlier and built a long record of arrests across Los Angeles County and San Jose: burglary, false imprisonment, drug possession, and probation violations. ICE detainers had been lodged against him repeatedly, but under local sanctuary policies, he had been released 6 different times without notification to federal officials. By early 2019, he was living in San Jose without stable housing, cycling between the street and jail. In the days after Larson's killing, investigators began pulling footage from home security systems around her block. One camera captured a shadowy figure wandering the neighborhood around 4:30 a.m., circling homes, looking into driveways, and eventually walking directly toward Larson's front porch. Another camera recorded the same man moving away roughly 20 minutes later. His height, his build, and even the slight tilt in his posture were immediately noticeable to detectives comparing footage from other police encounters. Still, the turning point came from inside the house. DNA collected from Larson's comforter and bedroom floor returned a match, Arevalo Carranza. Fingerprints and shoe prints were consistent with his boots. When police tracked him down on March 12th, he was carrying items linking him to the crime, Larson's electronics, and a knife believed to be the murder weapon. By that afternoon, he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, with special circumstances of burglary and mayhem, charges that, under California law, make a defendant eligible for life without parole or the death penalty. But as prosecutors prepared for trial, another reality emerged. Arevalo Carranza's mental state had deteriorated so severely that he could not follow the proceedings. Doctors diagnosed schizophrenia, noting hallucinations, disorganized thinking, and paranoia. A judge ruled him incompetent to stand trial and ordered him transferred to Napa State Hospital, the secure psychiatric facility where violent offenders are held for treatment until and unless they are able to face trial. Months passed, then years. Each time doctors reported progress, new symptoms emerged. He was restored to competency once, then relapsed. In 2 separate hearings, judges again ruled him legally incompetent, returning him to the state hospital. The court record shows a cycle with no sign of resolution, a defendant unable to assist his attorneys, a community unwilling to risk release, and a homicide case frozen in place while the man accused remains locked in a high-security psychiatric ward. Meanwhile, the evidence has never shifted. Surveillance still shows him circling Larson's home. DNA still links him to the bedroom where she was killed. The items recovered from his possession still match what was taken. Prosecutors have made their position clear. If he is ever found competent, they will seek a sentence ensuring he never returns to society. But even without a conviction, the future is already set. Under California law, a defendant repeatedly found incompetent for a violent special circumstance murder is held indefinitely, either until restored and sentenced or until doctors determine release is safe, something prosecutors say will never happen in this case. And if, in an unlikely scenario, he were ever discharged from the hospital, federal ICE detainers guarantee immediate transfer to immigration custody, where he would remain detained pending removal. In practical terms, every path leads to the same outcome. Carlos Eduardo Arevalo Carranza is never walking free again. For investigators, the case stands as one of San Jose's most disquieting crimes. A quiet street, a respected professional killed inside her own home, and a suspect with a long criminal history who slipped repeatedly through legal gaps until the night those gaps turned fatal. For Larson's family, the absence of a trial offers no closure. Only the knowledge that the system now considers him too dangerous and too unstable ever to return to the community. And while courts still technically wait for a day when he may be competent to stand before a jury, the reality is understood by everyone involved. His confinement is permanent, whether in a prison cell or a locked psychiatric ward. A brutality that ended one woman's life is the same brutality that ensures his future. A life spent entirely behind secure walls, never released. Number 7. Fermin Garcia Gutierrez. It was a Monday in early April, 2024, when police in Hamilton, Ohio, were sent to a small house on the 1100 block of South 13th Street. The call that came in was not a report of gunfire in progress. It was a request for a welfare check. Someone had gone into the garage and found a man on the floor who was not moving. When officers stepped inside, the scene was confined but clear. A 41-year-old man, later identified as Fernando Reyna Oviedo, lay unresponsive on the concrete. There were signs of trauma, and a closer examination confirmed what the first officers suspected almost immediately. This was not a medical emergency. It was a homicide. Paramedics could not revive him. The Butler County Coroner's Office would later rule the cause of death as a gunshot wound, and the quiet garage at the back of a modest house became the starting point of a murder case that would reach from a neighborhood street in Hamilton to immigration files documenting repeated removals across the southern border. The man Hamilton police and prosecutors would ultimately name as the killer was already in custody when Oviedo's body was found. His name was Fermin Garcia Gutierrez, a Mexican national in his late 40s who had been living in the United States without legal status. By the time detectives began asking about the shooting on South 13th Street, Butler County Sheriff's Office records showed that he had cycled through the local jail under different names and dates of birth. Federal immigration authorities confirmed that he had been deported repeatedly over the years. Early statements from the sheriff and subsequent reporting from multiple outlets put the number of removals at 7. Later television reports would say 8. The exact count varied by source, but the pattern did not. Each time he was removed, he came back. In March of 2024, weeks before the body in the garage was discovered, he had already been arrested on unrelated gun and drug charges and was being held when the homicide investigation began. From the first hours after Oviedo's body was found, investigators treated the garage as both a crime scene and a source of answers. Technicians documented the layout, collected shell casings, photographed blood and trajectory marks, and began reconstructing how a confrontation inside that confined space ended in a fatal shot. Detectives worked backwards from the time of discovery on or about April 1st, speaking with people who lived in the house, neighbors who had seen or heard anything unusual, and anyone who could place the victim and potential suspects together in the days before the killing. As names surfaced, one of them kept reappearing in both local records and immigration files: Garcia Gutierrez. When Hamilton police sat down with him to ask about the homicide, he was not coming in off the street. He was already in the Butler County Jail, booked on separate charges stemming from a March arrest. In that case, deputies had allegedly found a firearm and narcotics linked to him. During interviews about the shooting, according to later court testimony, Garcia Gutierrez gave a specific explanation for why Oviedo was dead. Detectives said he told them he had killed Oviedo because he believed Oviedo had assaulted his girlfriend. There was no public record of such conviction against the victim, and the allegation surfaced only as part of the suspect's account, but it became the core of what police called the underlying motive. The question for prosecutors was not whether the allegation of assault could be proven. It was whether the evidence established that Garcia Gutierrez had deliberately shot a man to death in that Hamilton garage. A Butler County grand jury was convened to review the case. In July of 2024, it returned an indictment that reflected the seriousness of the charges. Garcia Gutierrez was indicted on aggravated murder, multiple counts of murder, felonious assault, kidnapping, and firearm specifications. The aggravated murder count exposed him to the possibility of life without parole, or, under some circumstances, the most severe penalties the state allows. Prosecutors described the killing as intentional and tied it directly to the disputes and accusations that had unfolded before Oviedo's death. In addition to the homicide case, a separate drug case was pending, and the combined exposure left little doubt that, if convicted on all counts, he would spend the rest of his life in prison. In October of that year, the defense shifted its strategy. Through counsel, Garcia Gutierrez entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity and challenged the way his interrogation had been handled. His attorneys argued that his rights had been violated during questioning and that his statements should be suppressed. They raised concerns about his mental state and his ability to fully understand the situation when he spoke to detectives. The court ordered evaluations and held hearings on the admissibility of his statements. At the same time, the broader facts of his background continued to draw attention. Butler County Sheriff Richard Jones publicly displayed his photo and immigration history, emphasizing that he had been deported multiple times and yet was back in the county, now accused of killing a man in a residential garage. The legal landscape changed again in June of 2025. Instead of going to a full trial on aggravated murder, Garcia Gutierrez appeared in Butler County Common Pleas Court and agreed to a plea. Through an interpreter, he told the judge he wanted to plead guilty to 1 count of murder and a related gun specification. When the judge asked about his earlier interview with police, he claimed he had been very drugged up at the time and did not remember parts of what he had said. The court paused to confirm that he understood the nature of the plea, the rights he was giving up, and the potential sentence. After those questions were answered, the judge accepted the plea agreement. In exchange for the guilty plea to murder and the firearm count, the aggravated murder charge, the additional murder and felonious assault counts, the kidnapping count, and an outstanding drug case were dismissed. Sentencing took place on July 10, 2025, before Judge Jennifer Mwench McElfresh. The statutory framework for murder and a firearm specification in Ohio allowed for an indeterminate term, a mandatory minimum number of years followed by the possibility of life. After hearing from counsel and reviewing the pre-sentence report, the judge imposed a sentence of 18 years to life in prison. That meant Garcia Gutierrez would be required to serve at least 18 full years before the parole board could even consider release. There was no guarantee that he would ever be granted parole, and the board could keep him confined for the rest of his natural life based on the facts of the case, his conduct in custody, and the risk he posed to the community. The immigration history that surrounded the case turned it from a local homicide into part of a national conversation. Butler County officials pointed to the sequence of removals and reentries as an example of systemic failure. Federal immigration records showed that Garcia Gutierrez had been deported repeatedly and had still managed to return. Local jail records showed him booked under different names and birth dates. Those details did not change the elements the state had to prove in the murder case. For the court, the question was not about federal policy. It was about one homicide in one Ohio city. The evidence in that case, taken in order, showed a body found on a garage floor, a cause of death by gunshot, a suspect who connected himself to the killing in statements to police, and a plea that accepted legal responsibility for murder and the use of a firearm. The dismissal of the aggravated murder and other counts did not erase the core conclusion. A 41-year-old man was dead, and the person who admitted to shooting him would be in a state prison for at least 18 years before the possibility of release could even be considered. Whether the parole board ever allows that release is a separate decision that will not be made for many years. Number 8. Ezwin Mejia. It was just after midnight on January 31st, 2016, when 21-year-old Sarah Ray Ann Root pulled up to a red light in South Omaha. She had spent the evening celebrating one of the proudest moments of her life, graduating from Bellevue University. Her friends had taken photos. Her family had hugged her. She was driving home, alone, in the quiet hours of a winter night, only a few blocks from reaching her destination. She never saw the truck coming. Behind her, a black pickup was flying down the road at high speed, weaving through late-night traffic. Witnesses would later describe it racing another vehicle, swerving between lanes as if the driver had no sense of the world around him. Inside was 19-year-old Ezwin, often recorded as Edwin Mejia, a Honduran national living illegally in the United States. Tests later showed his blood alcohol content was around 0.241, nearly 3 times the legal limit. At that intersection, everything converged: velocity, alcohol, recklessness, and a complete disregard for human life. As Sarah sat waiting for the signal to change, Mejia slammed directly into the back of her SUV with such force that it shoved her vehicle into the intersection and crumpled its frame. The impact left her critically injured before she could even react. She was rushed to the hospital, but the trauma was catastrophic. Sarah died the next day. The night she celebrated her future was the night it ended. Police at the scene quickly noticed the signs: the racing, the staggering movements, the alcohol on Mejia's breath. He was arrested, charged with motor vehicle homicide, DUI, and booked into Douglas County Corrections. His immigration status was known. Local officers contacted ICE, and yet, as the Root family prepared for a funeral instead of a graduation party, Mejia was released on bond. He walked out of jail within days. What happened next transformed a tragedy into a national outrage. Rather than return to court, Mejia vanished. Authorities believe he left Omaha within hours of his release, heading south through multiple states, eventually slipping across the border into Honduras. Within a week, he was gone. And for nearly 9 years, he stayed gone, a fugitive who had taken a young woman's life and escaped into another country, while the system debated who was responsible for letting him walk out the door in the first place. ICE added him to its most wanted list. Sarah's parents testified before Congress. Senators drafted Sarah's Law, a bill designed to prevent exactly what had just happened, ensuring that undocumented immigrants charged with causing death or serious injury would be automatically detained, not released on bond. But the man at the center of it all remained beyond reach. For almost a decade, the memory of Sarah's smile, captured in her graduation photos, stood in stark contrast to the cold, empty space where accountability should have been. Families held vigils, lawmakers held hearings, and Mejia lived freely in the country he fled to, watching the world search for him from afar. Then, in early 2025, that silence cracked. Working with Honduran authorities, DHS confirmed that Eswin Mejia had been located and arrested. He was escorted onto a flight in handcuffs and returned to Omaha under heavy security. When he appeared in court for the first time in 9 years, deputies placed him behind glass, and the judge set his bond at an unprecedented $100 million, a figure meant to send one message: he would not vanish again. Mejia now faced not just the original charge of motor vehicle homicide, but also a felony failure to appear, punishable by additional prison time. Prosecutors laid out the facts: the street racing, the extreme intoxication, the red light, the deadly impact, the immediate flight, the 9-year delay of justice. In December 2025, Mejia stood before a judge and changed his plea: no contest to motor vehicle homicide DUI, and guilty to failing to appear. He offered no explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of the 9 years Sarah's family spent waiting for a courtroom moment that should have happened in 2016. He will be sentenced in early 2026. Nebraska law allows for decades in state prison, followed by immediate transfer into federal custody for removal proceedings, meaning Mejia will never walk freely in the United States again. One way or another, his future is sealed. For Sarah's parents, her brother, her friends, and everyone whose lives she touched, nothing brings her back. She was 21 years old. She had just begun her career. She had done everything right. And at a stoplight, at a moment when her life was filled with celebration and promise, she became the victim of someone who should never have been behind the wheel, never have been racing, and, as lawmakers would later argue, never have been released after the charges were filed. Her case reshaped immigration policy debates across the country, rewriting detention priorities and inspiring legislation that still bears her name. But at its core, this is a story about a young woman whose life was cut short, a system that failed at the worst possible moment, and a fugitive who spent nearly a decade avoiding justice before the law finally caught up with him. Eswin Mejia will spend the rest of his life in custody, first in an American prison, then in the hands of federal authorities. But Sarah Root will never come home, and the light she waited at that night will forever stand as the place where everything changed. Number 9. Sidi Mohammed Abdullahi. It was just after 9:30 on a quiet Saturday morning, October 26, 2024, when a 39-year-old Orthodox Jewish man stepped onto West Farwell Avenue in Chicago's West Ridge neighborhood. He was walking to his synagogue, like he did every Sabbath, wearing his kippah and prayer shawl, passing the same brick apartments and tree-lined sidewalks that had always been part of the city's historic Jewish enclave. He didn't know someone was following him. Just half a block back, walking with measured steps and a loaded handgun tucked into his clothes, was 22-year-old Sidi Mohammed Abdullahi, a Mauritanian national who had entered the United States illegally after crossing the southern border the previous year. Investigators would later piece together what his phone contained: maps of Chicago synagogues, Jewish schools, Jewish community centers, and more than 100 anti-Semitic and pro-Hamas videos and images. Prosecutors would call this moment the execution phase of a plan that had been forming for days. As the victim approached the 2,600 block, he never sensed the danger behind him. Abdullahi raised his weapon and fired. The bullet struck the man in the shoulder, throwing him forward onto the pavement. Witnesses began screaming. Cars stopped. The man lay bleeding on a sidewalk he had walked his entire life, in a neighborhood where Jewish families had lived for generations. The shooter sprinted away, but he didn't go far. Within minutes, Chicago police and paramedics converged on the scene. Officers searched alleys and yards, trying to locate the gunman. Paramedics began treating the wounded man near a Chicago Fire Department ambulance. That is when Abdullahi came back. According to prosecutors, he re-entered the street from behind a line of parked cars, took aim at the first responders, and opened fire. Bullets cracked through the air, striking the ambulance twice. 4 police officers and 2 paramedics were caught in the line of fire. Some dove behind vehicles. Others returned fire. One officer reported hearing the distinctive metallic click of a misfeed, evidence that Abdullahi's semi-automatic pistol had jammed during the assault. He fled again, cutting through a backyard, moving through an alley, circling the block as though trying to outmaneuver the officers. But he wasn't done. Seconds later, he appeared on another street, weapon raised, firing once more toward police. Officers shot back, hitting him repeatedly. Even as he collapsed to the ground, prosecutors say he tried to lift the gun again before his body finally gave out. He was taken into custody in critical condition and rushed to St. Francis Hospital. The victim survived. Abdullahi did not intend him to. While he recovered, police and federal investigators began examining the shooter's phone. What they found reshaped the case instantly. Search histories targeting Jews, mapped routes to synagogues, and ideological media celebrating violence against Jews. The attack was no longer just an attempted murder, it was becoming a hate crime and terrorism investigation. Within days, prosecutors filed one of the rarest charges under Illinois law: state terrorism. Alongside 6 counts of attempted first-degree murder, 7 counts of aggravated discharge of a firearm at police and firefighters, and aggravated battery with a firearm. A hate crime felony was added soon after. At his detention hearing on November 22nd, prosecutors told the court that Abdullahi had mapped out multiple Jewish sites and stalked a visibly Orthodox man specifically because of his Jewish faith. The judge, citing the nature of the attack and the evidence of pre-planning, ordered him held without bond. But Abdullahi would not live to face trial. On November 30th, while held in the medical unit at Cermak Health Services, inside the Cook County Jail, officers performing a routine check found him unresponsive in his cell. He had attempted suicide by hanging. Officials said there was no sign of foul play and no record of him being on suicide watch. He was rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital. He died the next morning, December 1st, 2024. The charges were never tried. The jury never heard the digital trail he left behind. The victims, the Orthodox man shot on his way to synagogue, the paramedics he ambushed, the police officers he tried to kill, never saw him stand before a judge to answer for it. But the outline remains. A young man who entered the country illegally, absorbed extremist propaganda, mapped out Jewish targets, and chose a Sabbath morning to carry out an attack that authorities say was both ideological and intentional. Sidi Mohammed Abdullahi never walked free again after pulling the trigger that morning. He died behind bars, under guard, ending a case that had begun with a single gunshot on a quiet Chicago street and expanded into one of the city's most alarming hate-motivated attacks in years. Number 10. Hani Khalaf. The groundskeeper at Hyde Park started his morning shift at dawn, just like he had for years. On August 12, 2016, the sun was barely rising over London, casting long shadows across the paths near Speaker's Corner. It should have been quiet, empty, a peaceful summer morning in one of the city's oldest royal parks. Instead, at 5:50 a.m., he stopped beside a motionless body. Lying near the path was 62-year-old Jairo Medina, a carer from Chelsea, known for sending money back home to support his elderly father in Colombia. His face and torso were marked by bruises, his clothing torn, his pockets emptied. Something terrible had happened hours earlier, something violent, sustained, and personal. By the time paramedics arrived, Jairo was already gone. The man who killed him was nowhere near the scene. He had fled into London's streets before the sun came up, carrying the belongings he had stolen from the man he'd just beaten to death. His name was Hani Khalaf, an Egyptian illegal immigrant who had slipped into Britain 2 years earlier, hidden in the back of a lorry. He'd claimed to be a Syrian asylum seeker, lied about his identity, and spent the next 2 years drifting through the capital, homeless, stealing for food, and repeatedly coming into contact with police and immigration officers. At least 6 times, authorities had the chance to detain or deport him. Every time, he was released. London became the place where he stole sandwiches to survive, slept in parks, and dodged immigration checks by giving false names like Hani Hassan. By August 2016, he was a familiar face to police, a petty offender who'd slipped through every crack in the system, and on the night of August 11th, those cracks turned fatal. That evening, Jairo Medina went to Hyde Park, as he sometimes did, seeking companionship. Friends described him as gentle, warm, and generous, someone who had spent years caring for vulnerable patients, never imagining he would become vulnerable himself. Somewhere near Speaker's Corner, under the cover of darkness, Medina crossed paths with Khalaf. What happened next was not sudden, it was prolonged and brutal. According to forensic findings and the prosecution's case, Khalaf kicked, punched, and stamped on Medina in a violent assault that left the 62-year-old helpless on the ground. When it was over, Khalaf rifled through his pockets, taking cash and his mobile phone, crimes the judge would later call murder for gain. Then he walked away and left Medina to die alone in the grass. In the hours after the killing, Khalaf tried to sell Medina's phone, and later that same morning, he used some of the stolen cash to gamble at a bookmaker's. He blended back into the city, just another rough sleeper moving between shop fronts and alleyways. Police had nothing yet. No weapon, no clear motive, no suspect. But London is wired with CCTV, and detectives reviewing footage spotted something: Medina walking with a younger man shortly before his death. When officers later arrested Khalaf for fare evasion, he gave another false name, but an eagle-eyed officer, as the judge put it, recognized him from the CCTV image. On August 18th, just 6 days after the murder, the investigation closed in. Khalaf was arrested again, this time for shoplifting, and fingerprint matches confirmed what detectives suspected. He was charged with murder and remanded in custody. During the trial, the jury heard the story of his life in Britain. He illegally entered the UK in 2014, claimed asylum under a false Syrian identity, arrested repeatedly for theft and fraud, freed each time while deportation arrangements stalled, sleeping rough in Hyde Park and elsewhere, stealing food and clothing to survive. Judge Wendy Joseph QC would later say that Jairo Medina paid with his life for those systemic failures. The evidence was overwhelming. The CCTV footage of the last person seen with Medina, the attempt to sell the phone, the stolen cash, and the injuries consistent with a sustained beating. After a retrial at the Old Bailey, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder. On August 24, 2017, the judge sentenced Khalaf to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years. She told him he had shown no respect for the law, and she called his actions a brutal and merciless assault carried out for money. For Medina's family, the verdict brought justice, but not closure. His sister described him as a beautiful soul who had spent his life helping others. His father, in Colombia, had relied on him for support. A gentleman who cared for disabled residents in Chelsea had died at the hands of someone the system had lost track of long before. For Khalaf, the future was decided. He will serve decades behind bars in the United Kingdom, and once his security category is lowered, he is expected to be removed to Egypt to finish his sentence. But even then, parole is far from guaranteed. A 26-year minimum for a man in his early 20s means he will spend the best years of his life under lock and key. Two men met in Hyde Park that night. One kind, one desperate. One trusted easily, the other took advantage. One walked into the park hoping for companionship. The other walked out with stolen cash and blood on his shoes. And at dawn, beneath the trees near Speaker's Corner, a groundskeeper found the cost of every decision that led to that moment. These cases show what happens when violent offenders slip through borders, evade systems meant to stop them, or exploit the cracks that should have kept innocent people safe. For the victims and their families, the damage is permanent. For the killers, the consequences are absolute: life sentences, death row, or dying behind bars with no path back to freedom. If you want more verified, fact-driven true crime investigations like these, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps the channel keep uncovering real cases every single week. Stay safe and stay aware. Until next time.